Okay, well, welcome back, everybody. It's 10:30 on the dot now, so we're going to begin our next presentation momentarily and hear from Chris Skelly of Skelly Preservation Services about infill development and design guidelines. Very quickly, before we start, just two housekeeping matters. I put the wrong link in the chat earlier. If you were joining for the intro I did prior to the last session, I mentioned a dollars and cents of multifamily housing development event on May 22nd. I put the wrong registration link in. My apologies. So I just put the correct link in. The other thing I wanted to say is please fill out, just a reminder, please fill out the evaluation that we will be sending out afterwards. For the last session and all future sessions you attend today. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chris.
All right, thank you very much. Happy to be here. Welcome, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about infill development and design guidelines. So my name is Chris Skelly, and I'm a historic preservation and community planning consultant. So I work mostly with my clients are mostly local historical commissions, historic district commissions, heritage commissions, and preservation commissions, basically the commissions that are part of municipal city and town governments. And so one of the things that often comes up is issues related to their historic districts and thinking about infill, thinking about how that's going to impact the significant historic resources in the community. And so this is one of the presentations that I offer to local historic district commissions or other local commissions that are concerned about that. I last presented this in South Carolina last year for this presentation, and I'll be presenting something similar in a few weeks. So keeping that in mind, I definitely appreciate your feedback on the presentation and want to continue to make it to improve this presentation as I give it to other cities and towns. So yeah, keep that in mind as we go along here. So yeah, welcome everyone. Happy you are here. And so we'll start off just thinking about, well, what is exactly infill development? When I think of infill, I think about vacant land that is in a built-up area already, but the parcel itself is vacant, and it's a really good spot for additional development. And so this is basically new construction that's taking place in an urban area or maybe a village center, but some sort of a densely populated area where it makes sense to have some additional development. We have a lot of infill, infill possibilities in our cities, and that has to do with urban renewal that took down a lot of buildings back in the 50s and 60s. So photos there, you can just see downtown Boston, the upper right, how much got cleared there. Other places in Massachusetts, New Bedford, Newburyport, places that were really just devastated from urban renewal. And so that left a lot of empty places or underutilized places compared to the density that used to be there turn of the century. And today that means there's lots of possibilities in terms of how we sort of stitch things back together again, because it's definitely impacts our downtowns, our village centers, when those vacant parcels still remain. It's like the missing teeth look. Things don't look right, and so there can really be a much better sense of giving it an overall urban space improvement just by having some infill development come in. Of course, what we're going to talk about today is how that can be best done. So new infill might actually be making things a little bit more dense. So this may have been a vacant parcel that came down during urban renewal. I'm not sure. This is actually from New Hampshire here. But it went in with a one-story building as opposed to the three-story buildings that would have been along this whole stretch here. And so infill might actually mean taking down a non-significant, non-historically significant building that's one story and putting something denser in its place. So that might make sense in some places. And some cities actually require this. One city that I've worked with, if you're going to do infill within their downtown, you're not allowed to put in a one-story building. You have to go higher than that, and that's really all about trying to create the density of the area and maintain the historic look of the downtown. When I think of infill, this is not what I think about. If you're thinking about infill, it should never require the demolition of significant historic resources. So when we're talking about historic areas, historic districts, which we'll talk about in a few minutes here, it really should not be part of a demolition that's going to require demolition of significant historic resources. That's not the type of infill that I would ever want to encourage, and I'd want to see more creative solutions to increase density in cases like that. So other possibilities where that building can still remain, but additional density might be able to go around it, on top of it, things like that. This is another one that I don't necessarily want to see. And this is what we might call a facadectomy. Some other names for this as well, but this is basically where you just leave the very thin layer there of the skin, the facade, and demolish everything behind it. This is really not what we would ever want to encourage. This basically means you've really lost the integrity of the building. There's so little left of it now that again, I'd much rather see some other creative ways to think about how you could do infill while keeping a far greater portion of the building there. Because this really impacts the significance of the area when you start doing things like this. So I see lots and lots of benefits to doing infill, really encouraging additional infill in our historic areas, our downtowns, our village centers. So that might be additional housing, some additional retail or office space. More pedestrians downtown is certainly a good thing. Economic development, definitely a good thing in terms of just additional jobs, in terms of construction jobs, in terms of additional jobs, in terms of the shops and businesses that are there. And then increased tax base. This is a big one that gets overlooked sometimes, just how much better you are off as a city if you do infill development in your downtown as opposed to sprawling out on the edges. Your per foot rentals are so much higher in your downtown areas than out in a sprawled area that means your tax revenue is going to be so much higher in your downtown for that reason. So certainly that's definitely a big benefit of infill, is really thinking about the municipal revenue as well. So along with that, reduction of sprawl, really trying to think about how we can have new development, new housing that doesn't require lots of open space eaten up, that doesn't require an automobile for every trip that's taken. And that one, of course, leads right into sustainability in terms of being able to bike or walk to certain areas because you're in a denser area as well. More nightlife activity in a downtown maybe. And some of your cities in New Hampshire are probably thinking about form-based zoning, which we can talk about that if you'd like later. But form-based zoning, a way of really thinking about how we encourage new businesses and uses in the downtown, but really put that couch that in the terms of what's the building going to look like, and is primarily that being the most important thing, how it's going to be compatible to its surroundings, and not quite so focused just on what the kind of use is going to be there. So lots of benefits to infill. Before I go on, I just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of when I talk about the word historic district, or when I say local historic district. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. So I'm just going to do a couple slides here on that, even though I think quite a few of you may already be familiar with the distinction here, but it's such an important distinction that I wanted to bring it up. So if you're on a historic district commission, then you would have what's in your city, what would be called a local historic district. So in a local historic district, this is established through a city ordinance, or it might be established through a town bylaw if it's a town. But in a local historic district, there's going to be a design review process before alterations or new construction can begin. So in that local historic district, yeah, new construction, infill, it's all going to have to go through some sort of a local design review process to make sure that that new design is going to be compatible to its surroundings. So this is typically done by a historic district commission, but there might be another commission or body that actually does that review. That is distinct from what we would call a National Register district. A National Register district is established by the National Park Service, and that's primarily an honorary designation. So obviously you could say, so there's no design review that's taking place in a National Register district. It's really just an honorary designation. And buildings get demolished in National Register districts all the time, actually. So National Register districts and local historic districts are completely different, but they're both called historic districts. So what I'll be referring to mostly today, if I say the word historic district, is going to be those local historic districts that actually have design review, that there's a historic district commission or some other board or commission that actually is doing design review to make sure that that new construction, that infill taking place, is going to be compatible. This is one of the YouTube channels that I watch. It's on urban planning, and this is a recent one they had on historic districts. And they just talked about how historic districts are often used as ways to prevent new construction from taking place, or prevent infill from taking place. This might be out of concern that the new development might not be compatible with the existing area, or might be out of wanting to make sure that there's isn't additional housing or density there. So some of those things can happen, but I just wanted to point out that that's not how it has to be. That's not how it has to be. That local historic districts can really be a great catalyst for having great development and possibilities for lots of new housing. Oops. Lots of new housing added within a local historic district. And so I'm going to give you an example here of where that's actually taken place, and that's in Portland, Maine, where 46% of Portland's new housing units added in the recent 5-year period were built in an area with regulatory historic preservation design review. So that's either going to be one of those local historic districts or something very similar to a local historic district, even if it's called something different. And so it really gives you a sense of just the possibilities in terms of areas that are historically significant, that you can still add quite a bit of housing there. There's a lot of density, a lot of possibilities in terms of adding new housing units into our historic areas. That even if sometimes, as that video suggested, creating historic districts is used as a way to keep out additional development. I think there's lots of ways that local historic districts can be a way to really encourage good development in the city as well. And that's because I think one of the biggest concerns is that visual impact. What's that new construction going to have as an impact on the historic area? And when you have design review taking place there, there's really possibilities to make sure that we're not going to have to just accept whatever comes our way. We actually have the ability to say, yes, we want that kind of development, and no, we don't want that kind of development. You don't have to, when you have a local historic district in place, you're not stuck with whatever is put forward by a developer. So if you're on one of those historic district commissions, you may be thinking, oh, it is really hard to review new construction infill and decide whether that's going to be the best option for that vacant parcel of land. It is probably the most challenging aspect when you're on a historic district commission to do these kind of reviews for something entirely new, something that we can't visualize. It's not like trying to think about a small change to the exterior of a building. This could be large, it could be prominent, and you have to visualize the whole thing as a historic district commission on paper or through maybe just a model. So yeah, definitely some challenges there. We'll address some of those here today. So 4 things that I would like to just cover today are, one, I'm going to talk about an example called the Taco Bell Bank. I'm going to talk about infill design elements. I'm going to talk about infill philosophies. And then we'll finish up on some best practices for infill in historic areas. All right, so starting off, we're going to talk about a historic intact village center, but it's not protected through one of those local historic district ordinances. Basically, in this village center, with no regulatory design review taking place, whatever a developer comes forward with, whatever is proposed, as long as it meets the certain requirements in terms of setbacks and frontage and things like that, height, it's going to be allowed. It has to be allowed by right in that case. There's no community involvement in terms of making sure that new construction in this village center is going to be compatible. So in this case, this little building that was built in 1954 was demolished. A few years ago, Kate Winslet in the movie Labor Day, she walked out of this 1954 bank because the movie was taking place as if it was in the 1980s. So it actually had some significance there in terms of being part of this Hollywood movie. But the building was demolished a few years after the movie took place. And this is what got put up in its place. And everyone in town hated this building. Oh, it was an outcry about this building. People actually were taking their money out of this bank and moving it to the bank across the street. The building clearly just simply did not fit within this tight village center here. And again, there wasn't any design review that was taking place. The building just went up and everyone was like, oh, wow, what just happened there? So it was really bad publicity for the bank. And it got a little worse because the bank became known as the Taco Bell Bank. And in the interest of going a little further with that, I had some fun on this slide to say, Taco Bell, think outside the bun. So everyone hated this building because it really didn't make sense to have it in a village center. It made sense to have it out on some sprawly highway somewhere. That's what it looked like it came from. This is what an architect never wants to hear from the public. Well, if that's the look you wanted, you sure got a good one. All right, so just 2 years after the bank was constructed, in the newspaper, facelift plan for the bank. Just 2 years after the bank was built, they were already talking about how we need to, because they're losing customers and getting bad publicity, we need to think about what we're going to do about this. This was a $250,000 project. $250,000 project right after 2 years after it had been constructed. When they had the grand reopening of the bank president served tacos and said, "The last tacos have come out of here." So the finished product ended up looking like this. It was better. It's not great. And so to me, what are some of the lessons that were learned here? One of the big ones for me is that design review, actually having design review and community input would have been a benefit to the property owner. Sometimes there's lots of pushback about not wanting to have a design review process in a local historic district. But this is clearly a case where, had there been a local historic district here, a regulatory process would have taken place. There would have been public hearings. There would have been public input. And the bank would have realized, oh, we got a real dud here in terms of a design. Let's think about what we have here instead for a new bank. And they would have saved themselves $250,000 and a lot of bad publicity at the same time. Let's talk about next some infill design elements. First one I'd start off on is massing, where we think about the volume of new construction to other nearby buildings. So clearly in a case like that, the massing has changed dramatically, going from that to that. But there's ways to break that up so that it doesn't appear quite so overwhelming to look at. One of the ways to do that is to think about breaking up that long expanse there into smaller pieces like this. And in practice, that might look something like this building right here, where I think you can see probably off to the left the original historic buildings, sort of tall 4-story, 3-story buildings there, and the new construction really broken up in terms of these segments so that it starts to mimic the historic patterns of the other buildings on the streetscape. And that really helps to break up that large massing of this new construction that got built here. Yeah, here we have some new construction as well, and so this is very different style of building. So the massing is going to come across as very different from its surroundings, even though that new building is just as large. And so there's a lighter sense to this building that's located just adjacent to some large mill buildings as well. When we talk about massing, we often think about what the solid to void ratio is, because that solid to void ratio can really change the perception of how we view that building. So few windows, high solid to void ratio, going to give the appearance of a much heavier building. Whereas we look at a building like this to the right, and we really see it, even though it's a much larger building, it's got a lightness to it. The way it's sort of rising up like that, the way it's set back, the variety, the number of windows, it really takes on a much lighter feel to it, even though it's a much larger building. So from that previous, the two slides ago, when the building that's up in the upper right-hand side there, could that building fit into some other context as well in terms of downtowns? It's possible, just because we'll talk about form, shapes, things like that as well. But there's certainly aspects of how that building could fit into other settings as well. All right, so I'm curious what your thoughts are on the solid to void ratio seen on this building. This actually is it's fairly new construction. I'm going to say within somewhere around 20 years ago, maybe a little bit longer than that. But yeah, this is a brand new construction right here. What do we think about massing in this building? It has a little bit of a disjointed feel for me, just in terms of the solid to void ratio. I think where the windows feel a little bit small in this building, I think, and it really changes the whole sense of the massing with that window pattern taking place. The other way to break up the massing on larger buildings, denser buildings in a downtown area, is to do what's known as a tripartite division on the facade. So this is very common on historic buildings, but it's also often used on new construction as well. And so we just talked a few minutes ago about how we break up the massing in terms of those bays as we go horizontally. If we go vertically on the building, there are ways to break up the massing of a building as well. And so you can see on a building like this, you have a pedestrian zone. You've got a large storefront window there, an entrance, signboard there. You've got the upper floors with all the windows there, and then something different happening at the roof line with the cornice or the parapet or something like that here. So in practice, that kind of looks like this. You can see on each one of these historic buildings, you really get each of those three distinctions. They're very clear. The pedestrian zone there, the upper floors, and then clearly something very distinct at the roof line as well. So yes, new construction uses this kind of technique as well. So even on a building like this, you can really see the distinction in terms of the pedestrian zone, the upper floors, and then a different design element up at the roof line as well. And so these are the kind of things that really make a big difference in terms of breaking up a large mass of a building. They have other advantages as well in terms of the pedestrian zone, which I'll talk about that in a few minutes as well. All right. Another thing to think about is just the siting of the building, how that building is going to be positioned on the property itself. So you want to really think about that streetscape and maintaining that streetscape. This is one of the worst things that happens in downtowns and village centers, is where the building gets set back so you can have the on-site parking right in front. Devastating aspect to our village centers and downtowns when this happens. Really want to maintain that front line there, that all of the buildings are right at the zero or so setback from the street. And that's why I really want to make a big part of that is just making sure that the pedestrian experience really is a pleasant experience there. If you have a lot of cars backing out in terms of the parking in front of the building, that really impacts any kind of pedestrian activity that's going to take place there. All right, scale. Relationship of new construction to other nearby buildings. So scale can be a big factor in terms of historic areas. When something really becomes very out of scale, it's very jarring in a historic area. So possibilities in terms of having taller buildings than what you typically have. There are some possibilities there in terms of how that scale things can still remain within a comfortable scale, even if they actually are taller than some of the other buildings that are in the area. This one here, this is in Kentucky. It was interesting to walk past this one, and definitely was quite a bit taller than the other buildings nearby. And yet there was ways that it wasn't quite so jarring to me as I was on the street here. And I think that's partly because it still actually has that tripartite pattern here with a different, you can't quite see it because of the tree, but there's clearly a pedestrian zone in this building. There's a window pattern for the upper floors that actually very closely resembles a lot of the historic buildings. And then you get that cornice up at the top to clearly make that distinction. So that definitely helps to bring the building a little bit more in scale when it picks up on some of those same design patterns of the historic buildings. Well, tell me what you think about this one. So imagine you have a one-story building and then you have a two-story building, and you want to put something in between there so that so the scale sort of meets the transition there. And so maybe you could go for a two-story building, maybe it could be a one-story building, but you want to think a little bit of how you make that transition in infill that's in between these buildings. In this case, they ended up doing something not like that. They did something like this instead. And so it was sort of like A for the effort to try to think about how you transition from a one-story to a two-story building in scale. But this really brought in such a different form that obviously it really isn't. It didn't work very well for a historic area to have infill that was going to look like this. All right, proportions. The relationship of architecture elements on a particular building to other architecture elements on the building or other nearby buildings. So if something looks like this, all of a sudden the proportions are very much out of character to the other buildings around here, and that could be very jarring and incompatible to a historic area as well. So tell me what you think about this. Think about this one for a little bit. If you were going to do infill within this development, what would it look like? Because here we have all these architectural elements that are really oversized. So this is a development from the 1980s, postmodernist Graham Gund development, and all these architectural elements are purposely designed to be oversized. And so we really to think about how that's going to get done. If you were going to add any additional infill in this development, you'd really want to be thinking about how that new infill is going to be compatible with these outsized proportions. That's not where we're usually thinking about in our historic areas, but it's an interesting example. Another few photos of it here. You can just see sort of how things got put together on these buildings. It's an interesting development. All right, I can move on to shape. Shape being either the form, the contours, the outline, and that might mean in terms of the overall form, it might be the contours, the ins, outs, the ups and downs, the variety of how things end up being put together on the facade of a building. Could be the outline, kind of more the two-dimensional look. Think of the two-dimensional aspects of a building in terms of how trim, windows, things like that all work together. So shape. I'm going to just give you this example right here. So this is the town that I live in, and so sometimes infill development occurs not because of demolition, but sometimes occurs from natural disasters as well. So I think I'll just give you a little background on what's going on in this photo here. This is during Hurricane Irene, and the river overflowed its banks quite a bit, and so you can see the river to the left, and what is the road to the right in front of that red building there. So that red building got built a few years before Hurricane Irene and withstood that flooding that took place. But I think you can probably get a look, get a sense of, there's a pink building. Okay, yeah, so the pink building that's now sitting in the middle of the road, that was located to the right-hand side of that red building. And it got washed down. It got washed down off its foundation, washed down the street, and ended up in the middle of the road right there. So it was demolished once, of course, it was in the middle of the road. And then there was a vacant lot next to the red building, and they decided to rebuild in that location. But of course, they needed to make sure that it was a little bit higher, a little bit better designed for any possible additional flooding that was going to take place there. So that's what they came up with. And kind of an interesting example, just because the red building is actually what I would say new. It's like within 20 years old. And the green building there, the newer construction, that architect really thought about, okay, how am I going to have a building here that's next to that red building that's going to be compatible here, but also distinct. And he really thought a lot about the actual form of the building, that rectangular form of the facade here, and wanted to make sure that the new construction really was compatible with that kind of a form. So the shape was really what dominated here in terms of being compatible. So that's a little close-up of it right there. So hopefully they will both survive the next flood down that street. All right, orientation would be is about the orientation of the new building to the surrounding features. And so again, it's about that street pattern itself, trying to make sure that street pattern is really remains unbroken. And so when you put in a building that looks like this, it really changes the aspect of walking along that street, experiencing that historic streetscape. So really trying to make sure that the orientation of the buildings really stays true to the other buildings along that streetscape. So you can imagine on a street like this, just how jarring that would be if something along this streetscape had an orientation that was not parallel to the sidewalk. All right, another design element to think about for new construction is just fenestration. So fenestration means the arrangement, proportioning, and design of windows and doors on a building, how they all go together. And so just think about fenestration. Look at this amazing mill building here, and just think about the amazing rhythm of those windows there, and how it's like it goes off to the horizon. It feels like it's just amazing. But there's a real clear rhythmic pattern there to that building. So that's the fenestration for that building. But fenestration isn't always going to be that rhythmic, and certainly for early buildings like the ones on the two bottom right-hand side ones, fenestration pattern could be very, very different based on lots of other factors in terms of the framing of the building. And even for modernist buildings, the fenestration pattern could be quite a bit different, such as on the Gropius house up at the top right-hand side there. So for this one, I'm going to take you to a maritime New England village of early 19th century buildings. Again, this one has no local historic district. So no local designations, no design review that's going to take place in any new construction that's going to happen here. And the new construction went in with fenestration that looked like this. And so very, very incompatible with the other buildings around. Very, very overwhelming. You really, it's like you don't even, walking down that street, you're not even going to notice the historic buildings as much as just this new construction, which is just, your eyes are going to immediately be drawn to that instead. So that wasn't upsetting enough to the village residents that they began learning about local historic districts right after this and trying to think about whether they could have a better design review process within their village. The other design elements, just all the details, arrangements, the textures, the colors, the sizes, the shapes, all things like that. And then just materials as well, so related to that is all the materials that might be used on the exteriors, whether it's going to be wood, masonry, steel, glass, fiberglass, or other substitute materials. And here's one to think about right here. This is in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And the building that you're looking at is entirely substitute material. So there is absolutely no wood at all in this exterior. It is entirely substitute materials, all AZEK products, if you're familiar with what that is. So one thing to think about in terms of new construction infill within historic areas is just the whole aspect of the materials that maybe just fine on the exterior with some basic maintenance for 100 years, 150 years, 200 years. They're lasting very well. How will these new materials, these substitute materials, last? Even if there's a compatibility aspect there, will they last as well as a lot of the historic materials that we've used in our historic areas? And then for infill, just thinking about the pedestrian relationships, thinking about walkable places that feel comfortable, safe, have social experiences taking place where you're meeting people there, and how important this is in terms of new construction infill design. That the pedestrian is really the primary user to think about in terms of new infill. So on the first floor, just thinking about if it's in a retail business area, that you have that visibility through the shop windows, that you can really look in and get and connect with the retailers that are there, that you can really see what that shop sells just by looking through the windows. And that's a really wonderful experience as a pedestrian to have that kind of connection, whether you're going in or not. It's just a far more comforting experience as a pedestrian to be able to look in through shop windows. An aspect that is not comfortable for pedestrians is when you have something like this, when you have the vehicular access across the sidewalks to the two on the left there, definitely things that you do not want to have, where you have lots of either parking garages or individual garages. These are the things that kind of really impact a pedestrian in terms of not feeling comfortable. The two on the right-hand side are actually all new construction. So I wouldn't necessarily call it infill because it was such a huge area that was redeveloped. It was one of the largest parking lots I think I've ever seen. So this is in Somerville, Massachusetts, outside Boston. And instead of an enormous surface parking lot, it became this incredible mixed-use, walkable downtown neighborhood. There's a lot of the design elements that we're talking about today are going to be seen in this Assembly Square area. It's not quite infill because everything is new though. other part of that pedestrian relationship for infill is, can the pedestrian easily identify where they would enter a building? Is the entrance highlighted in some way that they know where to go as a pedestrian? Again, I think that makes a big difference in terms of pedestrian feeling comfortable, safe, and wanting to be in that area. So what are the visual cues that you get as a pedestrian walking in a historic space like this? To the right, you can definitely see that tripartite aspect of these buildings, where you have the pedestrian zone, the upper floors, and then the cornice line and the chimneys up at the top, defining the roof line. To the left-hand side, you clearly see all those windows and being able to clearly connect with all of the shops there and have a good, comfortable feel as a pedestrian in that way. But what about the visual cues that you get when you come to a street that looks like this? And just how you want to keep walking down this street. I did not even want to stop when I walked down this street right here. It's a real, there was an uncomfortable aspect to being here without having with having windows, but without being able to see in it all in terms of what's happening in the shops there. All right, I'm going to jump onto our next section here, where we're going to talk about infill design philosophies. And there's lots of different ways to think about design philosophies when it comes to infill. So I'm just going to put forward the way I see it, but you might have some other ideas, and if you do, I'm certainly interested in hearing what else you would add in terms of a design philosophy. First one in terms of infill design philosophy is replication. Where we're really trying to have a literal interpretation of a style. And so this is actually in Portsmouth. Maybe somebody's on here from Portsmouth and they can give me the background story on this, because I'm really curious about what happened with this building here. So I was walking in Portsmouth 2 years ago, and I walked past this building, and it didn't quite look right. I knew something was a little bit different about this building in terms of it didn't quite match the other Greek Revival buildings that were on the streetscape. So I took a photo of it, and then I came home and did a little research. So they said it's in Portsmouth. You can picture the other Portsmouth buildings in the area here. So when I got home, I went to Google and I did the Google streetscape, but from prior years. And sure enough, I went to the site, and there wasn't a building there just a few years ago. So it was actually new construction. And so there was another Google photo of the building being constructed right there. And then the finished design here. So this is one of the design philosophies in an historic area, is replicating the other kinds of architectural styles that are present there. This isn't necessarily what we want to see in terms of historic areas always, but it certainly does work plenty of places. And part of the reason we don't want to confuse, it's the confusing of history that comes in terms of replicating historic properties. But this is certainly a viable design philosophy within a historic area, is to kind of match what's around there. A little bit different is interpreting a style. So instead of a literal interpretation of a style, this is really interpreting it and going a little further with it. So you might think about this sort of relating to 19th century Second Empire buildings, where they've taken in some of those elements of a Second Empire building with that mansard roof, but they're playing with it. They're going a little further, and there's no confusion here in terms of this build being an historic property. It's clearly new construction, but there's clearly some interpreting of a previous style that's taken place here. Interpreting styles has gone on for quite a long time. I mean, we go back to that Greek Revival houses, yeah, these all relate back to a Greek Revival temple. So we've been interpreting styles, for a long time, going from this monumental building down to small scale single-family residential buildings. What do you think about this one, though? So this is in Miami Beach, and there's lots of Art Deco in Miami Beach. That's just wonderful, amazing things. And it's a lot of the Art Deco in Miami Beach is a nautical theme. So a lot of it's meant to look like cruise ships and big ships that would go out of Miami. So it's a little bit of a special kind of architectural Art Deco style. And new construction took that and made a Burger King out of it. So you can see there's different ways to think about whether that's going to be the best solution, because it's a little bit jarring in some ways to think about how a fast food restaurant is going to take on some of the elements of this nautical theme. I'm going to give you another one. So this is Italianate, and I'm going to show you an example of how they have interpreted the Italianate, 19th century Italianate architectural style here, this time on a McDonald's. All right, I'm going to jump on to the next one here. And next, infill design philosophy. Call this one intentional opposition, where you're really trying to make a broader statement. We're not trying to do anything in terms of a literal interpretation of a style or interpreting a style loosely. Here we're really trying to do something that's in opposition to the other buildings around it. And this is certainly going to be a design philosophy that's going to work in a number of places. This one's in Cambridge, Massachusetts. This is on the MIT campus. And so a really interesting facade here, really amazing to walk by. But I think it works here just because it's not impacting significant historic resources in its vicinity. So this is Frank Gehry design here. Interesting design, but as you might imagine, the building did leak. And there was actually some lawsuits involved in terms of how the leaking of the building here. So one way to think about a success for a building is this rating system here. All good architecture leaks. And so it's the bucket rating system on whether the building leaks or not. And you're maybe familiar with Falling Water from Frank Lloyd Wright. That one on this bucket rating system got 6 buckets for the leaks that it has at that property. All right, any thoughts on this design statement, though? This one definitely creates some anxiety inside me. I look at this building and I'm thinking I want to go have my chamomile tea after this, because it really brings up a lot of anxiety when I look at the angst inside me when I see something like this. So the infill design philosophy that is most commonly used in historic areas is what we might call compatible yet differentiated. So it's compatible with the historic buildings that are around it, but it's differentiated in some way that you can clearly recognize that it's new construction as well. That's often what we are most looking for in our local historic districts, in our historic areas. Downside of this is that it can be boring sometimes. We can end up with some really boring buildings. Here's one for me that I think they just really missed it on. So if we look at, okay, was it replication? Okay, well, so if the new construction is on the left, the historic building that it's across the street from is on the right-hand side. For design philosophies, was it replication? Nope. Was it interpreting a style? No. Was it making a statement? Definitely not. I'd say for infill design philosophy on this one, they were trying to do the differentiated yet compatible, but they ended up with something particularly boring and banal, I'd say. So if we go back to all of those elements on the right-hand side, massing, siting, scale, proportion, shape, orientation, fenestration, details, materials, pedestrian relation, there's going to be a couple places there where I think they've really failed in terms of the new construction. Massing, I think they've maintained a massing that's similar to the building across the street. Siting, they actually maintained it's at an intersection, so they actually replicated the curved facade there. Scale, it's going to be about the same scale. Proportions, still pretty good. Shape, I think still good. Orientation, it's fenestration and details, I think, are places that I think this building really didn't work well at all. The window patterns here, and then the details in terms of just windows that just have a very punched out look. There aren't details there that really bring the windows out to the forefront. Everything just sort of it just looks flat. It's a very flat looking building to me. This is another one. One a little harder, maybe a little bit harder to define in terms of those philosophies. Nearby buildings you can see over to the left-hand side, and then the new construction off to the right-hand side, where they try to replicate the neighborhood buildings. No, they weren't trying to replicate them. Did they try to interpret the style? I would say, yeah, there's an interpretation of the style here. Are they making a statement? They are making a little bit of a bolder statement in terms of how they've put this building together to the form. Is it differentiated yet compatible? There's aspects of this building that are certainly compatible to the other buildings in the neighborhood, and yet very clearly differentiated as well. So in this one, I feel like it hits on a number of these ones in terms of interpreting the style, making a statement, and being differentiated yet compatible as well. All right, we'll talk a little bit about some best practices for infill in historic areas. And on this list, it's really a lot of the things that you need to think about before you even start thinking about whether that new infill is going to be compatible with the other historic buildings in the area. So having a good historic property survey form, that basically means, do you have good documentation for the other historic buildings in the area? So you really know the kinds of historic resources that you have there. It's all about having good information in front of you in terms of what you have in your community. We'll talk a little bit about the Secretary of the Interior standards, but I don't have too much time to talk about those today. But that's basically the national guidance for how we treat historic resources, historic areas. Design guidelines, a big one. I'll mention that in a minute as well. Having a historic preservation ordinance in place so that you're not just having to accept everything that comes before you. You can actually say, yes, we like that design, and no, we don't like that one. Try again. It's great when there's actually staff available in city or town hall to be available to help you in the volunteer historic district commission members in that process, but lots of district commissions do not have a dedicated staff person. you always really want to be going out and really walking around the whole site, just really looking at the site itself, looking at what's special about the other buildings around it, making sure that your application process, if you have a design review process, that your application process is very detailed and that you're going to get all the information that you need in terms of being able to review that new construction. And also then just finishing up the character defining features, which I'll talk a little bit more about, because that's really one of the starting points in what infill compatibility is a key part there. It's just the character defining features of the district and the specific property. So a couple slides here just on character defining features. They are the elements of your historic area that make it unique. So whether that's an Italianate district, a Greek Revival district, Queen Anne, whether it's brick, masonry, what are the chimneys, the windows, all those kinds of things. They are all the things that make your historic area a unique place. They're known as character defining features. So you can think about this building right here. Character defining features on this building. Oh, there's just so many of them. You have the Gothic windows there, the Gothic pointy dormers there, this wraparound porch. Lots of things there that if there was a neighborhood of buildings that looked like this, the new infill would want to at least take into the existing character defining features into account. That could be even true here. So there's character defining features on this in this mill housing right here. So every one of these buildings has been altered in terms of new windows and vinyl siding and all that. And yet driving down the street, there's clearly a character defining feature here of the rhythm of this mill housing. You're clearly within a mill. There has to be a big mill somewhere nearby. And so new construction, if one of those buildings were to come down for some reason and there's going to be new infill, it'd be really important to think about the character defining feature of that roof line, that streetscape, those buildings right at the sidewalk line, and how that new infill is going to fit within that streetscape. Character defining features in a mid-century modern neighborhood, yeah, that's an issue as well. So this mid-century modern neighborhood outside Boston, when it was constructed, you were not allowed to build a colonial house here. You had to have a palette that was going to be a modernist look. And so there are actually some reasons why some new houses are getting built into this mid-century modern neighborhood. And same thing, this is not the kind of new construction that they would want to have. They would want to make sure that any new construction within this mid-century modern neighborhood really considered the character defining features of the modernist architecture here. Same thing if you were at the Earthship community in New Mexico. Character defining features there. Any new construction would really want to make sure that it took into account the existing significant character defining features. So a house like this might work just fine in many local historic districts, but it would be very, very out of place in a place like this. All right, design guidelines, absolutely essential if you were going to adequately review new construction. So your design guidelines should have a whole section graphically presented, making it very, very clear to every developer, every property owner, what kind of design would be appropriate within your historic area. So this is going to be very, very dependent on not only the kinds of character defining features that you have in your historic area, but also what does your community want? So your design guidelines should be should clearly convey what the community is looking for for what they want, that how they want the community to grow into the future. And that's going to be I'm going to go to this one right here. That's going to be very much based on things like master plans, your comprehensive plan, a downtown revitalization plan, an economic development plan, a housing plan. Do you understand in terms of what your community's goals are, and do they match up with what the Historic District Commission is looking for as well? So if they don't, that's definitely a big problem. So best practices for infill in historic areas. This could be years in advance. You've got to be part of a process to make sure that the infill that's going to go into your community is going to be compatible with the existing historic buildings that are there. So I did mention the Secretary of the Interior standards. I have a whole 90-minute presentation on the Secretary of the Interior standards, so I can't go into this too much in detail, but it does talk a little bit about new additions, related new construction, and this basically gives us our nationwide context for good preservation practice. Off-street parking, real trend right now to make sure that off-street parking is not a requirement. So this is going to be one of those things that it may actually be for infill. It may be the parking in a lot of cases that has the biggest impact on a historic area when you require off-street parking. And if you can eliminate off-street parking and try to think about this more creatively, there's a lot more possibilities in terms of having much better infill design. So this isn't the mill here, this huge mill that was adaptively reused. It's not infill, but it's an interesting example. Just because the city said to the developer here through their zoning, we're not going to have any parking requirements here. You figure out in terms of the uses in this building what's going to work for your development. And so it was really up to the developer to make sure that the uses that were there and the way people are going to arrive at those buildings was going to be something other than just coming in a single occupant vehicle. And so it happens to be on the bike path, and that was one of the ways that they could have more people visit this building for working or for retail because they can arrive by bike. There's a new apartment building. I don't think it's been constructed in Boston yet, but they basically it's right near transit line, adjacent to transit, and it's a large building, but it has no off-street parking. And so this is out in the Mattapan area near the train station. No off-street parking, and on top of that, they say if you purchase a unit in this building, you're not going to be able to get a on-street parking permit. And the idea is to really discourage new automobiles in that area. That they're really that's a process that's really going to encourage more affordable units for one thing, because you can have a much denser development because you don't have to have on-site parking. But also it means that bicycling, walking, and transit use are going to go up because most of the people there are not going to actually own a vehicle. If you are on a historic district commission and you are wondering whether you are ready to review some new infill based on some plans that are before you, and it feels a little overwhelming, yeah, I'd say get some outside design review assistance. If you don't have an architect or other design professional on your commission, make sure you have some way of contracting with an architect for some guidance, so that you can make sure that what you're seeing in front of you is what your community wants. Good to be communicating with designers, contractors, the development community itself. Best, of course, if that's done through a master plan, but if not, find other ways to really be communicating with all of these people in terms of what's in your design guidelines, and so that you can get the message out in terms of the kind of infill that you're looking for as the design review Historic District Commission. And another best practice for infill is think long-term. Think long-term about what's going to be best for your community. Don't accept everything that's comes before you. It's one of my favorite quotes here. So think what's going to be best for infill long-term, and don't feel like you have to accept everything that comes before you. We saw some examples in terms today where details, materials can make a big difference in terms of the compatibility here. So just make sure you're asking for all kinds of samples of materials and other information so that you can clearly understand what you are reviewing and whether that new infill is going to be compatible in your district. Okay, and then don't be limited by thinking that new infill construction has to be on a cleared site. It doesn't necessarily have to be on a cleared site. I'll give you one example here. So this is in Jamaica Plain area, Boston, right here. So you can see the building in the center here, the brick one-story building here. That's the before. And instead of clearing that site, they put in a rooftop addition that looks like that. And so there are lots of other examples here that I've seen in terms of how infill can actually be set back a little bit, or other ways that the historic building that might actually be at the street frontage can remain, but an additional infill structure can be added to the back. All right, I didn't put in all the things that I could think of for best practices for infill. I'm sure you could probably think of a few more. So if you have a few minutes here, feel free to put those in the chat. And I think I still have a couple minutes here if we want to just have a few questions or discussions.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Chris. This has been incredibly informative. Yep, we do. We'll give folks a minute or two to put in some questions if they have any. We did get some comments in response to your asking for feedback on what people thought about some of those buildings earlier. So we'll just read through those real quick as folks are kind of contemplating their questions. So the first one was
here. Okay.
Yep. These are all comments. Yep. Can you see them, or I can read them to you?
Yeah. Yep. So it looks like the first one is Julie's.
These were older. Julie's questions were from the last session.
Oh,
so these are just comments.
Right, that's fine. Okay.
So if you start at Dan Whittet at 1117 said, I noticed that utility and other obstacles get placed in the sidewalk, giving priority to vehicles. I believe this was in response to that newly built house in Portsmouth that you pointed out that was built to look of a historic nature. I don't know if that was just a comment about kind of what was going on or just more of a general comment. Okay. And then let's see, we have no more questions yet.
Tom says he likes the sloped 2-to-1 building. Okay. All right. Great. So it's always fascinating to see to read some of the comments when I put lots of examples up of what's liked. Okay. Yep.
And then we have a couple of thoughts about the BU building. Yep. And Dan said, designed to intentionally be an icon of the campus, it's also net zero. And John said, totally agrees about the BU building. The MIT Geary building, on the other hand, pedestrian interface is seriously lacking on the street side, and many other places it misses the mark despite landmark icon status.
Yep.
So we do have a cut. We're almost at 11:45, but I do want to make sure folks, if they do have questions, since we are right up here up against the lunch hour, so if we do go a couple minutes over, that is okay. So anybody if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. As a reminder, in the meantime, again, like I said, prior to the start of this session, please fill out the conference feedback survey for each of the sessions that you've attended today and plan to attend during the rest of the day. All right, here's a question from John. Do you have advice for a small town with less capacity and developers with less resources?
So John, what do you have for design guidelines would be where I would start. So I'm assuming you have you're on a historic district commission.
Let's see what he writes back.
So how come I can't see that in the chat?
Really?
Nope.
No, I'm not just on the planning board. This is 1144.
It's on the planning. Anyway. Okay. All right. Yep. Now I see it. All right. So I'd start with your master plan, thinking about what's in your master plan right now in terms of what's desired for infill based on what the wording in that. If you have a master plan coming up, you really want to think about where your community wants more development to occur. I would think about the basics in terms of just having good documentation on historic resources in your community. That means having good survey in place. And then after that, I'd think about having a good set of design guidelines and making sure your design guidelines really adequately cover new construction. That's going to make it much easier for you as a volunteer members when you have a good set of design guidelines in front of you.
Great. And then we have one more question. Actually, two more questions. And comments here. So we can go over a couple minutes. So Infill and Very Rural, this is from Susan. Infill and Very Rural Historic Districts presents issues 2. Any advice specific to very small towns? Did you see that one, John?
So I see Infill and Very Rural Historic District presents issues 2. Any advice specific to very small towns? It's one of the issues is that you're very much on your own. I'd say is the challenge in a rural area is that you as a volunteer don't have anyone else to look to in terms of staff. I probably don't have enough time to go into all the issues that you might be having in your rural community. So I think I would just again think about what do you have for your design guidelines and really just being able to utilize your design guidelines as much as possible. So I'm not sure how best to answer that without more background in terms of what you're facing in your community. But feel free to email me later and I'd be happy to respond.
Great. There was a question from Christina about the final 6 slides after the Q&A. I don't know if we have time for that, but if you want to, I don't know if you want to go through that real quick.
Okay. Yeah, I'll just run through them quick. I wasn't sure how much more time I would have. So this was an interesting example here. So these are 2 buildings side by side. They're infill on the edge of a local historic district. So one is in the historic district and one is outside the historic district. And basically what happened was the building department accidentally gave a building permit for both of these buildings, even though one of them was supposed to have gone through design review and gotten their proper certificate in place, permitting, before they got their building permit in place. So, basically the line went right between these 2 buildings, and it looks like this. So you have nearby buildings up at the top, a nearby alteration up at the top, some nearby new construction, and the building got caught later that it was not properly permitted. So the one on the left had to go through design review after construction had already begun. The one just outside the local historic district had no design review and was able to continue to completion. So you can see in terms of shape, form, they're exactly the same. But what the district commission on the left-hand side did was really encourage some additional details, additional trim, other aspects to make that building a little bit more compatible to the district. So I just brought it up just because I thought it was so interesting, where you really see two exactly the same buildings, but one had to go through design review, one didn't. One's in the local historic district, and one isn't in the local historic district. The other ones are just I've done this as part of a design review exercise where I asked everyone to comment through the chats what they think about each one of these new construction buildings. Obviously, we're not going to have time to do this, but I'll go through A, B, C, and D here. New construction residential. And what do you think about that one for new construction? What do you think about that one for new construction? What do you think about that one for new construction? And that one as well. And I think you already saw that one right there. All right, so anyway, those are good, interesting discussion ones. They work a little bit better in person when I give a design review exercise in person, where we can really have a big discussion about each one of those examples. All right, Noah, is Noah here still?
Yeah, I'm sorry. We have one final question. If you're
Okay.
you're here to take one more, if you could take one more question from Donna. Our local architect believes that any design guidelines are inappropriate. Any thoughts? He used the term racist.
I think I'd have to have more information on that. No, I can't imagine why design guidelines would be considered inappropriate. They really are the best way of having additional infill and having additional housing included within a local historic district. So yeah, I don't know. Email me later. I'd like to hear more about what's going on.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Chris. This has been very, very informative. I want to thank you one more time. I did put your email in the chat for folks that want to follow up with you. And everybody, we're going to we'll resume at 12:45 for our next session after lunch. Lessons learned from the Housing Opportunity Planning Grant Program, HOP Grant Program. And again, like I said earlier, please fill out the conference evaluation form. And we'll see you back here in a little less than an hour.
Great. Thank you, Noah. Great to be here, everyone.